So thank you very much, Roman, for such a kind introduction. And Bures to you, which means hello in the Sami language, from the Arctic capital here in Tromsø. I'm really excited to join, and I hope that we can have very meaningful conversations going forward. So today we have a very straightforward task, which is for me to give a presentation of what it means to have self-determination discussions in the context of Indigenous peoples and resource utilization. Indigenous peoples have in the past globally faced serious policies of assimilation or ethnocide. They have been treated as marginalized group or people who didn't have enough civilization, just like the other extreme of people. In Norway, we have this policy called the Norwegianization policy that was instituted closely to almost 80 years that saw Samis in Norway abandon their identity and take on the Norwegian identity. It was shameful to be regarded as Sami. And just as we can also compare in Canada, where Canadian Aboriginals and First Nations had to be taken home and taken to boarding schools, all in the sight of letting them assume a new identity of Canadianness. So one more second and then, yeah. Now, this history of Indigenous peoples is not something that has gone away because we do remember some of the hard times that Indigenous peoples had to go through the majority population. And for that reason, we have some concepts coming out like Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Currently in Norway, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document all the past atrocities or the past policies that have sought to take out Sami out of their natural shelf to kind of document what kind of process it led to the shamefulness that Samis feel as a result of decades of policies that sought to show them as subordinate to the mainstream Norwegian class. And the same has been done in Canada, documenting the hard times that Indigenous peoples have gone that have resulted in some of them losing their identity and their languages. And so within this background, that now we are coming to terms with all the things that happened in the past. And at the same time, we're showing commitment to wipe off the sadness that has been caused by decades of policies of assimilation. At the same time, now we are faced with new emerging challenges that perhaps should call our minds to what was done in the past so that we do not repeat same mistakes. And these new challenges has to do with the rights of environmental movement and climate change, where we are looking at how we can all solve climate change issues, right? So in the bid to solve climate change issues and to also look for affordable energy, Indigenous peoples' territories and lands are becoming subject to mass exploitation and mass activities. So that will be the focus of my presentation. How does this new call of renewable energy affect Indigenous people's decisions and self-determination? So our two main discussion point today is what factors influence Norwegian and Canadian renewable energy policies, and how does Indigenous people's right to self-determination and FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent, reflect in Windfarm license processes. Just a brief history. Now, you should know that actually what is happening in Ukraine is a crystallization of our current energy problems. If you are in Europe, you would know that the shutting down of the gas pipelines from Russia has had enormous effects on European countries, and that is driving fuel prices high. For the first time, the United Kingdom government is giving out almost £600 to families to help them cushion up the rising cost of energy. So energy politics is important. Who gets what and when and how. It's very important for nations who do not produce oil and gas or do not have enough in their coffers to safeguard themselves against any shock. And so now there is the need to look beyond and over energy, fossil fuels. It is also important to know that about 80% of contributions of chemicals to climate change can be found in the fossil energy sector. And so these two reasons kind of push for a new paradigm. States want independence from other oil producing countries. At the same time, states also want to contribute their quota towards reducing climate change. And renewable energy has been seen now to offer that potential to solve these two problems, because one, renewable energies, they are not geographically specific. Irrespective of where you are on this planet, you can be able to tap into solar energy. It's not as if like it's an oil rig located in a continental shelf or anywhere. But if you have the right technology, you can harvest power from the sun, and the same with wind. And so this is the realization that many countries are beginning to come to. At the same time, climate change concerns us that climate change does not affect only one nation. For us in the Arctic, we have a first-hand effects of the climate change. But at the same time, we know that rising sea levels in the Arctic does not only stay in the Arctic, but it trickles down to other parts of the world and also has some repercussions. So these are the global concept, the global context within which these discussions are held. But specifically, what are the reasons that affect renewable energy policy in Norway and Canada? One, I think it is energy security issues. It will interest you to know that about over 90% actually of power generation in Norway is from hydroelectric power, which we can fairly argue that, oh, this is renewable enough, or this is sustainable enough. But at the same time, periods of low rainfall affect the quality the quality and cost of electricity, driving electricity high whenever we have shortage of rainfall. And so the Norwegian government has made it part of its strategy to look into renewable energy. And from around 2000 to 2005, we saw some initiative from the Norwegian government, such as establishing the inaugural Renewable Energy Fund to look into partnering companies that invest in renewable energies. If you look to Canada, energy security issues for them is very huge because they have a lot of indigenous populations who are living in very far and hard to reach communities. And these communities kind of depend on diesel generation power plant because they are not connected to the main grid. So renewable energy sources are becoming opportunities to assuage some of these energy security challenges. I mean, the second reason we can find is that the cost of renewable energies are becoming very low. Technologies improve, and as technologies improve, we get the total cost of producing some of these materials, either for wind energy or solar energy, coming down. And so for that reason, we are seeing more energy efforts from companies and governments into this field. The last reason, which I think has to do with environmental concern, we should agree that the Paris Agreement and also the European Environment Act, which Norway has signed to, and Canada is also a signatory to the Paris Agreement Act, kind of give a commitment and hold down industrial countries to contribute to their quota into fighting climate change. And the principle of common but differentiated responsibility within the framework of the United Nations framework on climate change kind of stipulates that countries who historically have contributed more to depleting our environment should also do more in assuaging it. And that is why we find in Norway, there's a lot of use of electric cars, and the government also gives a lot of incentives for the use of electric cars in Norway. So these basically are the reasons that are driving state renewable energy policy in Ghana. We can rule away the fact that there are energy security concerns, and also secondly, the fact that countries want to also contribute to the international agreement of fighting climate change. But the main topic now is, how does all of this feature in self-determination and the concept of self-determination and the right for free, prior, and informed consent. Now, the concept of self-determination is an international one, and this arises as a result of the fact that indigenous peoples living in their own countries face challenges to find and get their voices heard. And they resorted into the United Nations system to get them recognized as peoples. That means people who live within a territory but can be seen to be independent enough. So one of there are two actually international laws that regulate the rights of indigenous peoples, specifically the ILO 169, which is the International Labour Organization Convention 169, which is a treaty, which means that countries that have signed this treaty must have to incorporate it into their laws and also adhere to it. So Article 7 of ILO 169 tells us what self-determination of indigenous peoples are, which is basically the right to decide and to choose their priorities, and also to choose the forms of government under which they live. And this kind of also throws in a lot of questions. At what time should indigenous people's ideas and institutions be more than state? So there are two perspectives. One perspective of self-determination is that we talk about internal self-determination, the ability to choose what is right for them, but at the same time, it doesn't give them an independence that makes them like a sovereign state more than the state that they can find within themselves. But the general agreement is that indigenous peoples must have the power to choose what is best for them and to decide what their priorities are. And the second law that we can find is the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, which is a declaration which means that it was passed by the United Nations General Assembly. And this has a lot of support, even though this is a soft law, it doesn't have the power to bind. But most of the times, cases in courts, international courts, have tend to cite this particular law. Self-determination actually works hand in hand with the concept of what we call free, prior, and informed consent, which means that anything that happens on the lands of indigenous peoples needs to have their input, right? And this input must be free. It shouldn't be forced, and they should be informed of any project at the start or even before the start, so that they are within the process from start to finish. But one of the controversial things that has been mentioned within this aspect of free, prior, informed consent is the aspect of consent, which means that consent means yes and no. Does it mean a veto? So, for example, if the state of Norway wants to erect a wind farm energy in particular land that will be influenced or that will be affected by Sami reindeer herding, does it mean that when the Sami group or in reindeer herding say, no, we don't want this, it is a veto that should not override what the Norwegian government want to do? International law is not very clear about this, but I can say that ILO 169 only makes consent obligation on the state when indigenous peoples have to be forcibly removed from their lands, or they need to be given a different land. And that is when consent is mentioned. But otherwise, there is a mention about consultation and participation in ILO 169 without an express mention of consent. On the other hand, UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, mentions FPIC consent in almost everything in terms of getting the consent of indigenous peoples at the time of legislative and administrative action. So UNDRIP is far-reaching in terms of its insistence of making sure that we get the consent of indigenous peoples. And we can find this in some of these articles. If you are interested in looking into these articles, you can follow them more, and then you can find more discussions about what it means to have a free, prior, and informed consent as stipulated within UNDRIP and ILO 169. But we don't have much time, but hopefully if there are questions, I'm running through this. If there are questions at the end, then I can take those questions, and then at the same time we can have a good discussions going forward. But if an energy developer in Norway wants to start a process of having a license to have wind farms erected within a specific land, this is the process that kind of kind of outlines from the Norwegian Water Resources and Energy Directorate that have to be followed. And one is the early notification of project. If an energy project developers wanted to go into a specific place, they have to first inform the NVE, and then NVE would publicize the application. That's what I call the informal aspect of this application process. And then people who would be affected are all called to listen to this application and to also make their concerns heard as to what must be studied. And all this, it goes through all this process until there is a license application. There's the public hearing license application, which means that people have the opportunity to influence discussions about the application process. And then there's a license decision that is taken by NVE. If the license decision that is granted is not in favor of any particular party, they can appeal to the Ministry of Energy, and the Ministry of Energy will take it up. So an important aspect of this process is, as I have outlined, is what we call environmental impact assessment. And this acts as the basic document that influence decision. And environmental impact assessment has also been mentioned by the International Labour Organization Convention 169, Article 7.3, which says that in case of any project that affects Indigenous peoples, there should be a study, and that study should be the fundamental basis for which a decision must be taken. And so this kinds of act as the board game, that if you influence what happens in the environmental impact assessment and you get your concerns across, then it's likely, if it makes sense, that NVE would use that document as the basis for decision. So this has become an area of power contestation where you have Indigenous peoples, the energy developers themselves, nature and biodiversity groups, environmental groups, all within this space, trying to influence what happens. Then in Canada, the process is not very different from in Norway, only that Canada has a two-way system of impact assessment and also granting licenses. The federal impact assessment deals with not only issues about wind energy, but also with mining, road construction, and even building construction. So anything that has to be done with some impact on the society must have to go through impact assessment. And as you can see from the key participants in the impact assessment system, it's a lot of other groups with competing interests, and Indigenous peoples have to struggle within this process. So quickly, I see that I have just about a minute more to go, and I would just make it short so that we can take on the discussion. So as I said, in Canada, Canada is a federal state, so they have both like a federal impact assessment system and also a provisional impact assessment system. And this sometimes goes hand in hand in conjunction with the federal system if the project has some financial obligation from the federal state. The cases I want to present to you today is the Naikun offshore in British Columbia, just to show how how self-determination and the rights for free, prior informed consent can be seen in these cases. And the Haida Nation, they can be found, it's an archipelago that can be located in British Columbia. And for them, as a rural community, they are not connected to the main grid system of Canada. And so they dwell so much on the use of diesel power plants. And this obviously has environmental concern, but also it has cost concern because it costs 3 times more to produce energy on this diesel if you're not connected to the national grid. And so the project from the Naikun offshore had a lot of promise. It was going to construct 110 offshore wind farms, turbines. It also had the possibility to reduce greenhouse emission. It also had the power to give power to up to 130,000 homes, which is far and beyond the population of Naikun, right? But at the end of it, there was an internal vote within the Haida, and they thought that this project was very ambitious. It had some sentiment of colonialism because they were producing more power, and then the intention was that they were going to export it to the United States. And they thought that this didn't align with their community values of self-sufficiency and self-determination. And so eventually, even though the environmental impact assessment license was granted by the BC, which British Columbian provincial government, they rejected this collaboration with Nikon Offshore, and then the project didn't come on. And the project in Norway has to do with another place in Finnmark, which is where we have the Samis living mostly. It's called the Kvalsund Wind, and the Kvalsund Wind Farm has a very interesting plot to it, because the decision from the Norwegian Water and Resources Commission to deny this particular wind farm comes from two sources. One, from a petition that came from the Norwegian Directorate of Nature Management, which said that the proposal to have the 128 megawatt capacity of wind farm in Kvalsund is likely to affect a bird that is called snowy owl. And this snowy owl is not a very, the bird is mostly going into the extinction, and for that reason the bird needs to be protected. And this, they cited the principle of precautionary principle, which says that any government or executive decision that must be taken on issues that we do not have full proof or full knowledge of, we must put a stop to it until such a time that we know exactly what effect might come about. And so the precautionary principle kind of already saves animals that are likely to go into extinction, but they do not also they do not cover reindeer herding, because then it's now assumed that reindeer herding will go into extinction. But the Sami Parliament also mentioned that reindeers would be affected when we have wind farms instituted. So as you can see in a picture, some people do not understand, for example, how wind farms could affect reindeer herding. Reindeers are very shy animals, and for that reason, when they have these wind parks established, it kind of also affects their grazing area, and they are not able to have a wide area for them to graze. Imagine if you have 150, 200 of these turbines, and the space that it will take. And so these are some of the reasons that indigenous reindeer herders have raised, saying that this would eventually take them out of reindeer herding and could be injurious to their livelihood. But what can we learn from the lessons in Norway and Canada? I think that there is different engagement happening between Norway and Canada. Mostly, about 38.7% of wind energy produced in Norway can be found in indigenous people's lands, which means there are a lot of cases that go unnoticed because indigenous peoples do not have a lot of influence in these cases. But I decided to show you a case that a decision went positive, to show some of the agency, or sometimes some of these decisions do go in favor of indigenous people. There's heavy procedural participation, no doubt. Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of participation from at the time that an edge developer submit an application, and at the time that the NVE, or also the environmental impact assessment office in British Columbia set up the terms of reference for impact assessment, until the final part, there is a lot of procedural participation of indigenous peoples like other people else, but there's not too much substantive in terms of how the voices of indigenous peoples are felt, and the fact that whether when they say yes or no is meant to be a veto. And that is really not the case. Indigenous people still have to deal with this. And this can be found in one of the cases in Norway called the Fosen case, that have been very popular last year, when the Supreme Court said that the decision of the NVE and the decision of the ministry after an appeal to uphold the licenses of Fosen to construct wind farm in the Fosen area was illegal. And this was seen and heralded as a landmark case in Norway. So basically, this is the outline of my presentation. I would be willing to discuss with you more. And if you have any question, because of lack of time, I had to rush through. But if there is any substantive questions, and if there's more time, then I can elaborate on your questions and we can have a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for insightful presentation. What can be the attitude of indigenous people, their reaction, and the fact that we should build more these high voltage power lines, mega pack lithium storage devices? Yes, because they are costly, yeah, on the one hand, and also they also have are carbon price. Yes, so-called carbon price. So can you just elaborate on this topic a little bit?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ekaterina, for your intervention and your question. I mean, I have heard about questions about nuclear power plant. Indeed, in Canada, we have what we call the SMRs, which are like a small nuclear reactors. So it's small nuclear reactors. So communities that are not on the national grid, they find it as very productive to have small nuclear reactors. And if you go to Saskatchewan, this is one of their biggest investment now. And you would see that Indigenous peoples are taking the front seat in this initiative. They are owning the companies. They are those who are registering the businesses. They are those who are going into partnership with investors to promote this. But at the same time, you realize that SMRs have not been accepted throughout Canada by all Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous peoples in Ontario, for example, who still are very cautious about using SMRs because then it involves the use of other minerals or other minerals that have to be done through mining, and also that affect some other parts of Indigenous communities, right? And also the fact that we do not know like what are the effects of these nuclear reactors. There hasn't been any. We don't have much studies to show whether they are there are some of impact on health, for example. How would this impact the health of the communities? How would this impact the health of the biodiversity? And so some of the Indigenous communities in Canada that have rejected or have not been very keen to accept SMRs or small nuclear reactors have done so based on these reasons that there has not been much research to see what kind of influence this would have on them in the future. But what I can say about power lines is that we are seeing agency of Indigenous peoples, like the power for them to decide what is good for them at a particular time, And so for the Naikun offshore, as I said, one of the reasons why they rejected the plan was that they were expecting a pipeline from the offshore connecting to their homestead. But the idea was that they were going to connect power lines to British Columbia first, and British Columbia will now supply these archipelagos with light. They didn't want that. They wanted self-sufficiency. They wanted to be at the center of issues, because for them that is self-determination, for them to decide what they want. And I think that we should give Indigenous peoples the opportunity to decide what they want. And then, Romain, I have reflections on questions. So if anybody has any questions, they can also probably tie it into some of these questions for discussions ahead as it is. What do we think? These are some ethical and dilemma questions that also come through.
We've got a question from Pavel, who is a colleague here at the Arctic Institute, and also who said, are there any lessons from the experience of Indigenous peoples' relations with major states on energy development in the Arctic that are important for considering Indigenous peoples' relations with major states and energy in other parts of the world, such as in the Amazon with Brazil or in China? So any successes of challenges in the Arctic that are important when considering other regions. And perhaps this time, Larry, this also ties to your experience with MRIP.
Yeah.
So go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question. In other parts of the world, like there's a case I studied in Ecuador that has to do with even hydroelectric power. The high-handedness of government there is much more draconian, where people who are vociferous on against projects are kidnapped. Sometimes they are lost in the system. They cannot be accounted for, and those who are seen to be antagonistic to the government can face real hardship. And so at the same time, I think about the concept now that has been banded in academic term called this concept of state-friendly societies, where it's not like 100% of trust, but citizens trust their state and that they will listen to them, or at least they would have the opportunity to talk. And this is not comparable to, probably, as he mentioned, either to Ecuador or to the Amazonians, where the state of democracy is not really rooted in giving people the ultimate benefit to talk and to have their expressions expressed. In Norway, there's a lot of challenges, also power challenges in actually who affect the decisions, and the capacity of also indigenous peoples to address topics on impact assessment sometimes are highly laden with scientific jargons, right? And also the challenges of also getting indigenous peoples knowledge factored into impact assessment. These are some of the challenges, but overall, the level of interaction that we find within these states are very friendly, and there is some modicum of trust that goes both ways. But that does not suggest that everything that indigenous peoples ask for have been granted. So it really has to go with the kind of governance system that is instituted in these countries, and I think this should be the major concerns. Probably that is what explains why there has been a lot of cases in the American human rights courts than probably anywhere in Europe or in Americas, because there's a lot of case laws that borders on the Amazons, that borders on Mexico, that borders on Ecuador, that the inter-American courts have found the states culpable, and because they have not been adhering to ILO 169 or FPIC. So for me, I would suggest looking at the governance system and structure.
I don't remember if we touched upon the question of relations between indigenous peoples and biofuels. Yes, because the indigenous people use a lot of firewood. How, for example, indigenous people try to solve this problem, or are there any investigations on this topic?
Yeah, this is a very also important question. I haven't had a lot of investigation on this, but within I would say the touchlines of my research, I have come across some of these discussions about how biofuels could also be a very good alternative, but that has not been developed enough. As you've also adequately mentioned some of the challenges with it in terms of even some pollution that may come with it. That is in itself a challenge to look for clean technologies within biofuel, but I'm not sure there's too much of that focus, because now the world is always we are running to wind energy, we are running to solar, and that is where you see a lot of improvement in these technologies. Technologies of wind power 10 years ago has more than quadrupled, and so the more we practice with some of these things, the more we get better with technology, the more the cost of producing some of the equipment also comes down. But biofuel have been spoken about, I think, in Canada, especially also in British Columbia, as a source, but there has not been too much action on it, I think.
We have a question in chat from Matvey Chistikov, but can there be any positive consequences of developing renewable energy infrastructure for local communities?
I mean, absolutely. As I said, what is happening in Saskatchewan is an example of community ownership, right? I mean, the communities decide for themselves through like internal mechanism that kinds of have this impact assessment, and because all of these projects have to go through impact assessment, and off-grid communities and rural communities in Canada, especially Saskatchewan, as I said, because I know a few colleagues who are into the forefront of these nuclear reactors and how it can be a way to solve their generation. In Canada, power generation is the responsibility of at the provincial level. So provincial level make a decision of how do we produce the power that we need, and so these provinces look for the cheapest and also now the cleanest, they call it, and something that would let them reduce the use of diesel power generating plant. And the use of diesel power generating plant, no doubt, increases to emitting greenhouse gas emission. And this is one of the key concerns. And so for communities in rural areas who are off-grid, their main attention is how they can be self-sufficient in producing and generating power that they can use and that the community can use. And not only that, but also taking part in getting the benefit. Now they don't want to sit down and for a private energy developer come into it and have these nuclear reactors and feed off from their resources. Now they want to be parts. They are entering into a partnership with energy developers. They are shareholders into this into these industries. So I think that we see the benefit of it, but at the same time, it is not conclusive because not all indigenous peoples from far areas have accepted this, because their claim is that we do not know enough of what challenges this might bring in the future, and that we need to be careful in the use of nuclear reactors.
The question is, green colonialism, this is just not a dressed up version of not in my backyard, where people want the energy, but they don't want the side effects of the energy production, as there's always an unwelcomed footprint associated with the energy, whether it be mining tailings, flooding of lands, nuclear risk, and so on.
I mean, I think that these questions are very intriguing also. I've had a lot of Sami politicians talk about the fact that, look, indigenous lands had been used for exploitation for so long, since, I mean, in settler nations when there was a huge migration there, and also in countries where indigenous peoples have lived side by side with the majority population. Their concern has been now. So if our lands have been used in the past to mine gold, or to use our people to do certain things, or to let them lose their culture and identity, indigenous people said, we have suffered enough. Now, should we be also suffering for the effects of all of these things that you have said? Because then we want to also fight against climate change. I mean, this is the dilemma, because the idea that we can always come and pick and take everything that we can find in indigenous people's territories is what is problematic for them. It is not as if to say that indigenous peoples are averse with wind power energy, which would suggest that they are anti-development, or they don't want to see new inventions or to see new creations and manufacturers. That's not the point. I think that for them, it's about survival. It's about how can they survive, having faced centuries of policies that seek to strip them of their agency and their culture and their identity. And now the talk is about, oh, we need to go green, we need to do this, and at the same time, they are still facing the repercussions. I think these are some of the things that we need to reconcile. It's not like an aversion of green, but some do say, yes, not in our backyard, because we are given enough. And even if it has to be in our backyard, it is nothing about us without us, as they say, that we need to be part of the decision. We need to be part of those who take the decision, and our voices must count when state agencies take decisions regarding us.
Yes, but as a follow-up, I mean, when we talk about past examples, some of them are as draconian as the example that you gave in South America. But in a modern society, I think we have built into this, we have opportunity to build safeguards into the land not being destroyed, that we can return it to some level, but of use after the project has left. I mean, mines are particularly notorious for causing damage. But when we look back historically, I mean, there are some examples of what not to do. Can we not provide adequate protections so that we can get the benefits? And particularly when we look at some of the more recent indigenous land claims, where we give them control over thousands, if not millions, of acres or hectares of land, that it starts at some point it becomes unreasonable for a small number of people to hold up a project which seems to be able to provide benefits to millions of people or to the larger society.
Yeah, I mean, great point. I do not disagree with your point, because even in the claim of mitigation of impact assessment, there is what we call mitigations, right? So that if there is a particular wind farm that may affect the grazing areas of indigenous peoples, there are discussions about mitigation. There are suggestions about mitigation. What can be done to lessen the impact and the influence? And at areas where there have been very forward-thinking mitigation measures, indigenous peoples have accepted it. It's not as if that it is no and it's no all the time, right? But mitigation efforts can work, but at the same time, it's not all the mitigation efforts that work. Some mitigation efforts have been to carry reindeer herders and to supply them with fodder to eat. But we are also talking about survival of livelihoods. You know, we are talking about culture. We are talking about protecting people. So modern society, as you claim, has this kind of structures to make everybody bring up what they think based on merit and facts, you know, or based on things that are doable. And I'm saying that at areas where mitigation has been found to be useful for indigenous peoples, they have accepted it. And at times where they find that it also threatens their lifestyle, they have refused it. And I think that this is something that we have to come to terms with. Sometimes we don't come to terms with the extent of the loss and the damage that has happened to indigenous peoples. And mostly state bureaucrats have been seen to express comments that suggest that they don't even understand what it means to be indigenous and what it means to be, for example, a reindeer herder, you know. And so there is a need to make this education widely. We need to incorporate aspects of our histories into taking administrative decision. We need to know, what do these people stand to lose when a decision is taken against their livelihood and the cost of their survival. You know, so I think that this has to be done. These are the dilemmas that we have to think about. You know, we all want to save the environment, we want to save the world, we want to cut down emission. At the same time, some people have to give up more. And should it always be these territories like indigenous people's territories? Interestingly, the wind capacity of Norway is about 250 terawatts. That has been estimated. And almost half of this capacity can be found in Finnmark, that is Northern Norway. You know, even though not all of these areas have access to grid connection, but it tells us the kind of influence indigenous peoples have within these areas. And I think that it behooves on governments who want to create, as I said, a modern society where they listen to people, to institute practical steps where they can engage with indigenous peoples to find concrete solutions to things that would affect them, rather than saying, oh, perhaps this project is good for the environment, it's good for all of us, and so you need to water down on your beliefs, you need to water down on your culture, you need to accept this because it's good for mankind, you know. So these are some of the discussions that have gone, but we need to take our stance very carefully.